For Aspies, seeing things from another person's point of view or having empathy is something that doesn't come easily if you're not used to it. Some people may wish to seek genetic counselling due to the unconfirmed possibility of Asperger or autistic children being born, should you be considering children in marriage. Okay, come on up and say hi first. Come on up. Good girl. Hello. Oh, hi, beautiful. That's it. You snort into your microphone. You say everything you need to. You good? Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. I am joined today by my little Koopy bear, who is here and being a snorting piglet, aren't you? So today we're going to be doing something a little bit different and talking about something that's a little bit new for me to talk about here on my channel. Because since I started going through the whole process of like my autism assessments and stuff, I've had to do lots of things like fill out these really detailed questionnaires, and I have had interviews, and I've spoken to my sister about like what I was like as a kid and stuff like that, and it's kind of made me start questioning and I guess rethinking and readdressing a lot of the relationships I've had with people over the years, both in terms of friendships and like romantic relationships as well, and also dating experiences that I've had. I definitely struggle with dating a little bit. I find certain people incredibly difficult to communicate with. I find certain situations very, very difficult and anxiety inducing. I find kind of basic things that you might do on a date, like making eye contact, for example, are incredibly difficult for me. And because I have sensory issues around food and sound, it makes certain venues for dates almost impossible for me. It can be very, very overwhelming. And a lot of this kind of ends up affecting how people view me. And I've had a lot of men call me weird over and over and over. Sometimes they try and use it as a compliment. They're like, "Oh, you're not like the other girls. You're really weird." No, I like it. Don't worry. But it doesn't really feel like a compliment. But I think the biggest issue I've actually had is in more of like a long-term capacity, like trying to communicate with someone that I'm dating. Back when I was with Dan, who, as you guys know, I was with for like 4 and a bit years. During that time, we really, really worked on our communication skills with each other, and it really helped us both, and communication became quite easy for the most part. But with new people, it's always really, really tricky. So one of my friends is literally having so many of the same problems that I've had in the past, but kind of in reverse, because she started dating a man who's autistic, and again, they're having a lot of communication problems. So like the other day I was talking to her about it, and she brought up like this issue they've been having, and I was like, "Oh, all you need to say to him is such and such a thing." And she was like, "Oh, really?" And so she went away and spoke to him, and she was like, "Oh, I didn't realize it was that easy." But the things that she takes for granted in terms of communication and the things that he kind of needs to hear is very, very different. And that's kind of an issue that I've had, but from the other side. So I think this might be like a fairly common thing amongst a lot of autistic people. You know, sometimes because I can't always read things like facial expressions or body language or understand kind of like social rules very well, it means that I don't always recognize what other people are feeling, and I need to kind of ask for verbal confirmation. So I might be like, "What does it mean when you do this?" Or "How are you feeling right now? How do you feel about me? Do you actually really want to see me? Or is this like some weird," I don't want to say game, because it's not meant in a manipulative way. It's just in a, I think there are rules that certain neurotypical people follow that I don't really understand. So, you know, it can be frustrating for people for me to need to ask these things. Some people find it incredibly insulting, which is always difficult to deal with. But I always just try and explain to people how my brain works, and the best people understand that, and they help me through it, and they don't mind us having to communicate in a slightly different way. Sometimes I also find in relationships that or like just in dating, like I need to take a little bit of time to like sit and process what I'm feeling and think about how to actually put that into words. That's a big, big thing that I struggle with. And sometimes it's easier to put my feelings down in text, like to write a letter or a note or an email or something, than to actually be able to say them out loud. Sometimes I also struggle with thinking kind of too much in terms of black and white, which has been like a huge issue for me. And another thing is that sometimes I just get way too overwhelmed by my emotions, and all of this can be very, very frustrating for people. So that's just my experience. I decided, based on this, and based on knowing that other people clearly are going through similar things as well, I thought I would do some research into the topic and maybe make a video about it and talk about, like, autistic people in dating, autistic people in romance, autistic people in relationships, and so on. I was hoping that I could maybe go out and read some books, and because that's what I do. When I don't understand stuff, I try and kind of learn about it academically. Like with people, with making friends, this is what I do. When I struggle, I go and read books, and then I try and put it into practice in my life. Sometimes it works. We'll see. So I figured I was hoping to find out things like the best way to communicate and compromise with neurotypical partners, how to kind of like explain the issues that I have, but also my strengths, and why autism isn't just like a bad thing. It can actually be like, it's a really cool thing about me, and it means I have a lot of really amazing skills that some other people don't have, or I think about things in a really like interesting way that other people don't. And I want to be able to kind of like communicate those things effectively to a partner. And I was hoping to kind of learn a bit about how to date someone who quite often is very different to you without losing myself and who I am and putting myself in uncomfortable positions and so on. So they were the things I wanted to learn. I did not. Instead, I found a book called The Asperger Love Guide, which may be the most patronizing book I have ever read and is actually genuinely offensive in some places. I had a lot of problems with this book, and that is specifically what we're going to be talking about in this video today. Now, it's not all bad. There are some sections of this book which I'm sure will be very helpful to some people. There were some sections of this book that I did find quite helpful, but there are also some areas that I have huge problems with, and I felt they overshadowed any good bits or strengths that this book has, because mostly they perpetuate really harmful stereotypes about autistic people, and they basically boil everything down to trying to get you to be more normal so you can date. The idea is the only way you'll be successful in dating is if you act more neurotypical. That's what a lot of this just sounds like. And I have huge issues with this. So this book was written in 2005 by two autistic adults, a man and a woman, who apparently were a couple when they started writing the book, but were not by the time it was published. So that bodes well. There's some beautiful irony in that, isn't there? But despite this book being only 16 years old, it is incredibly outdated, and the fact that it's kind of still being sold worries me. The biggest one is that just most people don't use the term Asperger's anymore. It's sort of all under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder now, and it's really important to remember that when we talk about autism and autism being a spectrum, it's not like a linear scale. It's not like you're either very autistic or not very autistic. That's not how it works. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. It's more like a kind of circular scale where you'll be affected by some issues more than others, and different people will have different points at different things on kind of each of these mini scales, and it all kind of builds up a picture of who you are. The ideas of like low functioning autism and high functioning autism, it's incredibly outdated, and it's just not really accurate at all. Despite saying that like it's a disorder as well, like being autistic doesn't really mean that there's something necessarily wrong with you. It just means that your brain works differently from the majority of the population, and because society is set up for neurotypical people, sometimes that makes it hard to fit in, and it means that there are problems, and that's more why it's called a disorder, because it can affect your life because it's harder to fit in with the majority. It doesn't necessarily mean there's something inherently wrong, like, with a cancer or something. Cancer's inherently bad, autism isn't. There's a difference. The other thing I want you to remember before we start looking at specifics of this book is that this is like the first time I've spoken about this stuff properly and officially publicly in a video, and speaking about my experiences this way is terrifying for me. It's really scary. I'm still learning a lot about autism in general. I'm still learning about how my brain works and trying to figure it out, and it's nice to know that there might be an explanation for some of the issues that I've had in the past and some of the problems I've faced and some of the ways I've been treated. But I'm still kind of coming to terms with a lot of it and trying to understand a lot of things. And so basically the point is, I'm not an authority on this at all. I'm just one person, and all I can really do is talk about my own experience and maybe bring in a few examples of experiences by other autistic people that I know. You have to remember that every autistic person experiences the world slightly differently, and we're not all like autistic in the same way, if you want to put it that way. Like I said before, it is this big circular spectrum where some people might have more issues in one area than others, or some people might be able to cope better with some issues than others and so on. And just because you or I might think something is good advice, that doesn't mean that all autistic people will. And just because you or I might find something offensive, that doesn't mean all autistic people will. So please remember that, and remember that if you decide to comment on this video, please just be really respectful of other people and other people's experiences. I think that's really, really important. Okay, that's all the pre-ramble out the way. Let's jump into some specific sections of this book. I know some people don't like me doing a long introduction and kind of explaining an overview of things, but I think sometimes it's really important to say these things before we read the content because it shapes and informs how we view the passages we're going to read, you know? So the intro to this book is written by an academic called Luke Bearden, and I actually think it's pretty excellent. This little introduction here is the best part of the book by far. It includes sections like this. There is nothing, absolutely nothing inherently wrong with having AS. Repeat until convinced. I abhor the notion that just because someone is different, behaves in a different way, or has non-typical characteristics, then that individual is some way automatically considered to be lesser than their NT peer group. AS referring to, in this case, people with Asperger's, but kind of more generally people with autism, and NT being neurotypical people. And yet people with AS are disadvantaged in a multitude of ways every day just for having AS. Rather than celebrating the richness and depth of character that many people with AS have. And then later he goes on to write, the concept that having AS is just both positive and negative is finally filtering through the literature. This is because people with AS refuse to accept that the only way forward is to become less Asperger and celebrating the fact that they have AS, which I think is brilliant, and it's just a shame that the rest of the book doesn't live up to this. And I'm actually kind of confused why this guy wrote an introduction like this when the rest of the book doesn't really reflect this. He talks here about, people with AS refuse to accept that the only way forward is to become less Asperger. That's really, really important, and the rest of the book doesn't encourage that. It literally tries to get you to tone down inherent things about you and change them and not act in a certain way around partners, and it's don't do this. It feels like they're trying to get you to be more normal rather than sometimes just embracing those wonderful and slightly different parts of you. So going on to the actual bulk content of the book written by the main authors, and it opens with just stereotype after stereotype. For example, Aspies are seen to view the world in a logical, scientific, and intellectual way rather than an innate way. Following on from this concept, to begin with, we thought we would add in a section on the science behind relationships. And again, I'm just it seems... And I don't know, again, it just kind of seems a bit like they're putting us in a box. Plenty of us are incredibly, emotionally driven, not just logic driven. Not all of us like science. I just feel like statements like this, along with plenty of others that they make in the book, are just perpetuating the stereotypes that the media has portrayed people with autism as being in the past. This idea that we're all cold, nerdy, white men, and that could not be further from the truth. But it's okay, it's not just autistic people they stereotype, it's everyone, as we'll see in this ridiculously patronizing passage. It starts off well. You can do or be anything you want as long as you're not hurting yourself or anyone else, within reason, and of course not breaking the law. Wonderful. Leave it at that. But they didn't. The first type of person might prefer designer clothes, flash cars, binge drinking culture, watching football. The other type of person may prefer buying or making cheap clothes, going nowhere without your bicycle, drinking hot chocolate in a pub at night, playing chess. Many people wrongly believe that everyone ought to be the first type of person and treat the other group as outcasts, yet the second group has every right to do their preferred activities and should be proud to be individuals. If anything, their activities are safer, and they may make you more interesting people. If you're more likely to belong to the second group, then good for you. It's a free country after all, and thank goodness that some people don't follow the crowd, because the world would be very dull if no one was individual. It's just very odd to me because they make it sound like the first group are all neurotypical people, and the second group are all neurodivergent people, and there's no in between or crossover is how they make it sound. And it's weird because they're like, oh, most people will judge you for being in the second group, and then they go on to judge people for being in the first group instead, and it's very odd. Of course, you're allowed to do whatever you like, and I think this is again why it's quite outdated, because we're getting to a point where more people are way accepting of that and no one says otherwise. I just find this whole little section very bizarre, especially since it's followed up by listing all the things that people may perceive as weird about autistic people. Like, literally, there's a list, and then saying, some may consider you to be a rare find that they don't want to lose. After all, people with AS can be quite fascinating. Like, I don't want to be a rare find. I'm not a Pokemon. I'm a human like anyone else. I don't want people to find me fascinating because I'm autistic. I want them to find me fascinating because I'm smart and creative and a little bit silly sometimes, and I have the world's most wonderful dog, you know? I feel like talking about these things, I might be being a little bit picky and a little bit sensitive because these particular passages aren't too bad in the grand scheme of things. They just feel a little bit icky in the content, in the context of the rest of the book. What I was very, very excited about this book in the first place, and what made me actually buy it after a quick flick through, was because there's this section which goes into like autistic characteristics, how they can influence or cause problems in a relationship or dating. And then they have this like section of managing outcomes, and it's all down as like a table, and it's very straightforward. And I thought this sounded perfect. I thought this would be so, so helpful. This is exactly what I was looking for, except all the advice is really, really hit and miss. So this one's an example of like really good advice that it gives, right? So the characteristic being difficulties with eye contact, possible outcome being your partner could find your lack of over intense or odd eye contact off-putting. And this is something that I've absolutely experienced. People who like, I have this one friend in particular who's always like, look at me, will you look at me? I'm like, I can't. Theo, I cannot physically look you in the eye. It's like a thing. And he's just a friend I've had for like 10 years, but it's something where I'm just like, I absolutely cannot do it. And I do find it causes problems sometimes, like especially in dating, because that's how a lot of people like build an emotional connection, and it's something that I find incredibly difficult. So I understand this. Their way of managing outcomes is great. They say, look at their mouth or nose to give the impression of appropriate eye contact. Ask them to allow you times without eye contact. Learn together about appropriate eye contact, which is all really good practical advice. This is brilliant. I have found that in dating, explaining my aversion to eye contact to people allows them to understand more, and unless you're a bit of a douchebag, they normally don't get offended by it or insulted by it, and they know it's nothing personal. And I do find that things like on dates, looking at other parts of them like noses, mouths, ears, even a little shoulder every now and again, it gives the other person that feeling of the intimacy that they crave without making me uncomfortable. So I think this is great advice. Brilliant. Other sections like this are not as good. So you have this one, which is one of the characteristics is unusual intelligence. Possible outcome being could make basic communication and general conversation difficult if unable to separate intellectualizing from everyday life. Their way of managing this outcome is don't talk excessively about intellectual topics, and don't show off your knowledge any more than you have to. Those with AS intellectualize the world in order to understand a world they innately don't. Accept that this is a requirement for coping in life as an Aspie. Don't mind the last bit. Everything else, I have a huge problem with. I think one of the things that I am becoming way more confident admitting is that I'm incredibly intelligent, and I know that might not come across in all my videos. But like I am, and I always have been, and I think it's one of my greatest strengths, if I'm being honest. And I don't know if that has anything to do with autism or not. I don't know, it's just part of who I am. But this doesn't mean that I'm automatically more intelligent than everyone I date. This definitely doesn't mean I'm more intelligent than neurotypical people that I date. I generally tend to date people who are as smart or smarter than me because I do enjoy intelligent, intellectual, stimulating conversation. But regardless of who I date, I'm never, ever, ever, ever gonna dumb myself down for someone or not talk about something that I find interesting just in case someone, I don't know, is offended by that, or I don't know. I hate this kind of advice that basically tells you like to hide or change or tone down what I think is one of the best things about me. Like, don't show off your knowledge any more than you have to. Maybe not everyone will agree with this, but I think if you are knowledgeable about a topic and you're informed about a topic, I don't think sharing that knowledge is a bad thing. I love it when people share their knowledge with me. But it all comes back to, like, in this book, they always bring it back to, like, don't do anything that's too much something. Don't do anything that's too much you. Tone everything down. Hide parts of yourself. And I discussed this on Instagram the other day, and plenty of men said things like, well, that's what everyone does on dates. And this seems like really good advice. But funnily enough, most of the women who responded actually agreed with me that it was really, really harmful. So I found that a really interesting distinction that I did not expect. But I think one of the things that a lot of people forget when it comes to dating is it's not just about, like, selling yourself to another person and trying to make another person like you. It's about figuring out if the other person's right for you as well. And you can't really do that unless both of you are showing your real, full self. And I'm not saying you need to let out every single secret about you on the first date and tell everyone everything about you immediately, although I do sometimes struggle with that because I'm not very good with, I guess, boundaries. I'm a bit too much of an open book. But the point is, I don't think you need to hide or tone down fundamental parts of yourself from the beginning, because I don't think that helps anyone. If you're extremely intelligent, don't be afraid to show that immediately, because you will find that the right person loves your intelligence and won't be intimidated by it. If you're passionate about food, don't be afraid to show that, because the right person will love your passion for it. If you're an animal person, don't hide that, because you want to find someone who loves that about you, not someone who hates animals, for example, Whatever makes you shouldn't be hidden, because that's how you end up with the wrong people. Like, if a man was going to be put off by my intelligence, then he obviously isn't right for me. If I'm on a date with someone who hates hearing, like, fun facts about whatever I'm interested in that month, then they're also not going to be right for me, because that's something that I always do and I enjoy doing, and the right person for me will love that about me. And plenty of people do, There's nothing to be gained by hiding those fundamental things about yourself, except maybe prolonging or dragging out a relationship that's clearly wrong for both people. The next chapter talks about some really good stuff about, like, building up your self-esteem, and there are some really, really good points in this, but then it kind of lets it all down again with sections like this on appearance, and this is what I discussed over on Instagram, and I just find the whole thing incredibly patronizing, and it gives some really, really awful advice. So it starts off really well with the point, always be yourself. Everyone has their own style. That is what suits them, in which they feel happy and confident, which, yes, wonderful, I thoroughly agree with. And then it just devolves from there. So the point's gone to say, on a first date, it may be an idea to keep your style fairly neutral. Neutral means clothes that are not too anything. See, we're back to that point again. Whether they be too tarty, too zany, too trendy, too conservative, and so on. Try to choose an outfit that is attractive but doesn't stand out. When you get to know your date better, then revert back to your usual style. A bit of natural makeup goes a long way, even if you don't normally wear it. The natural look seems to appeal to many. That is, makeup used to enhance your natural features rather than hide them or over-enhance them. And I should also mention that this section is only aimed at autistic women. Men have different standards, like don't buy flashy clothes just to impress someone, and wash your hair. I just feel like sections of this are part of the whole you can only have a successful date if you appear like everyone else narrative that this book pushes constantly. And let's be honest, this actually just translates to you can only have a successful date if you act or appear neurotypical, which I take a lot of offense to. For someone like me, and you probably can't tell this based on what I'm wearing today, but if you've seen any of my other videos or you follow me over on Instagram, you'll know that I adore clothing, and fashion is absolutely, like, a special interest of mine, and I spend a lot of time collecting really bold, exciting clothes in bright colours and amazing patterns and unusual designs, and I also spend a lot of time altering my own clothes and searching vintage and second-hand shops for unique pieces, and just enjoying clothing, putting together really cool outfits and wearing things that stand out a little bit. I feel like my taste in clothing is a fundamental part of who I am, and I absolutely don't want to change that for anyone. But because of that, I'm also aware that I do have a really eclectic and bold wardrobe that will not be to everyone's taste. And that's okay, because I don't want to date someone who doesn't like my style. I would rather date someone different than change my style for someone. There's no point in me toning it down to impress someone when they're not the kind of person I should be with, and so I shouldn't be wanting to impress them, you know? But the point is, I think hiding parts of who you are, toning down parts of who you are, changing parts of who you are, just to get someone to like you, and then changing back like after a few dates and like showing them like, I know, a different side of you or something. Like, I think it's terrible advice for anyone, regardless of whether you're male or female or non-binary, or whether you're neurodivergent or neurotypical. I think it's just bad advice for anyone. I did okay, side rant here. When I ranted about this over on Instagram, I had this one comment that I just thought was incredibly rude and made all these like really incorrect assumptions about me based on my outward appearance, and this man upset me a lot. So he said, "You're definitely overreacting. This is dating advice for autistic girls and women. You're extremely attractive and neurotypical as far as I know, so you can get away with wearing literally whatever and no makeup. Also, most people have a range of outfits, some that are more them, some that are more neutral, but also still them. There's nothing wrong with advice to tone it down on a first date." And then, after a few more comments, he went on and blah, 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 blah. And this really upset me because, I mean, okay, fine, if he doesn't know if I'm autistic, that's one thing. But just because he personally perceives me as attractive and wrongly assumes I'm neurotypical, he thinks I can't be mad about this because I can wear what I want, like I'm somehow different to other people, and I'm not. He's right that I do wear what I want, but that's after like years and years and years of struggling with my own self-esteem and being bullied relentlessly over it, you know? It's like he's making all these assumptions on me based on the fact that he thinks I'm attractive now when he doesn't have a clue what I've been through in the past. And a lot of people see me now and don't realize that I haven't always looked this way. Not by a long shot. Especially as a teenager, I was bullied for years over being like the ugly, weird kid. And I used to have awful hair. And I got called Rachel Rotten Tooth because I had issues with my front teeth. My wardrobe was full of hand-me-down clothes that didn't fit me and didn't suit me, and I just looked an absolute mess all the time. Non-uniform days at school, I hated them because I usually ended up crying in a bathroom stall over comments that I got about my clothes because they weren't cool, or they were too weird, or people didn't like the colours or the fabrics or whatever I was wearing. In sixth form once, I literally had my media studies teacher make fun of me for I was wearing what I thought was this amazing fluffy red giant cardigan and matching red lipstick, and he just mocked me for it in front of the whole class. And then when I got home, my mum also made these like really rude comments about it and how I was like being too bright and bold and standing out and whatever. And like, it upset me a lot. That wasn't even the worst of it. It's literally only in the last couple of years since I started doing YouTube that I've had the confidence to do things like try different things with my hair, or play around with like different makeup, or wear these bright, bold, crazy clothes that I've always wanted to. And I feel like I'm finally able to be completely me for the first time, and it feels wonderful. It's so good. I feel so much more like myself. And I feel like I've learned, after a hell of a lot of work and tears and pain, I think I've finally learned to not value the opinions of people who don't appreciate my particular style. But it's not like I was just born feeling that way. It's not like I've just had everything handed to me. And like I say, I still go on dates with people who call me weird or worse. So it's not like I can just literally wear whatever, because I can't. I do still have to face the consequences of my choices to wear occasionally out there clothing, just like everyone else. I have people make comments to me on the street or shout things at me, or men who think they can just like insult me in a bar because of what I'm wearing or whatever. But I'm still gonna wear it, and that's something I've had to learn to have the confidence to do. Despite all of that, I've learned mostly to be happy and confident in myself, and I want other people to feel the same way too. And I think seeing books like this that tell myself and others, to do otherwise, to suppress ourselves, to hide ourselves, to tone it down, to try and be like everyone else, it does make me angry and upset. And I do think there's so much wrong with that advice. I do think it's damaging and harmful. The guy who posted that comment, and there were a few others that I ended up blocking him, but he he really genuinely upset me with some of the things he was saying, because he went on about how, like, it's not his fault, he didn't know my entire backstory, and I'm like, yes, that's true, but it's absolutely your fault that while admitting you don't know my backstory, you made a crap ton of assumptions and judgments about me and my history based on literally what you've seen me post, like, outwardly on YouTube or Instagram. Like, I'm really, really tired about people making assumptions about my past based on how I look now, or trying to tell me that my past experiences don't exist, or belittling them because they think I look like the wrong kind of person to have experienced them, you know, because of how they perceive my current appearance. Like, I'm nearly 30. I have not always looked like this. I spent, like, over half my life being mocked and insulted relentlessly for how I looked, and I spent the other half of my life working to try and overcome that and deal with it and physically change things about me where and when I could. My teeth, for example, I've literally had to have like months worth of dental work on them just so I don't get like continually insulted about them. And I mean, I still do, because they're not straight and they're a bit wonky and they're kind of weird looking, but what you guys have never seen on camera, or that I don't really talk about much, is my entire front teeth at the top. So every single tooth you see up here when I talk or when I smile or anything, they're all fillings. They're all white fillings. I had so much damage in my front teeth. They were just rotten. And it was very, very obvious anytime I opened my mouth. As much as people say things like, and I got this a lot on the femcel video, like, oh, you'll never know how ugly girls feel. Like, yes, I do, because I was absolutely that girl who got mocked and insulted relentlessly for something physical about myself. I mean, that wasn't the only thing. I hated myself for such a long time because I was so embarrassed about my teeth. I barely spoke to people. I didn't smile. I was so self-conscious. There's a reason you won't find more than 2 or 3 photos of me from the entire time I was a teenager, because I was so embarrassed of my mouth. And this wasn't just like, oh, you had to wear braces for a little bit like 80% of teenagers. No. I literally had rotten teeth filling the front of my mouth that were visible all the time. And that's without touching on anything else. There's a time that I had to spend months covered in tiny scars from when I got this like horrifically bad case of chickenpox, and I literally had, no joke, thousands of blisters covering my body, and then the scars were there for months. My face, my body, everything. I felt so deformed I didn't recognize myself. I literally had like blisters on top of blisters growing everywhere, covering my entire face. Another thing you don't see on camera are like the crazy issues I have with my hips. So like, I was born with dislocated hips, and to this day I still struggle to walk sometimes because of the pain. I walk a little bit funny, which makes buying shoes really difficult and tricky. I have this weird deformed kind of foot where a bone grows funny and like the toes are misaligned, and it's incredibly painful a lot of the time. Some days I'm absolutely fine. I can wear heels and go dancing with my friends or take Kyra on a little hike, and then other days the pain is so bad I can barely stand up or get out of bed. People don't see this stuff, and they don't see the past, and they don't see what I've gone through to get to where I am today, and that upsets me. All they see is this edited version of myself and this incredibly grown version of myself and almost like an evolved version of myself that I present to the camera. And people need to know that's not the whole story. Just because you see someone now and you might think to yourself, oh, they're quite attractive, that doesn't mean I've always been this way, and this doesn't mean I've always felt this way, and it doesn't mean that people have always treated me this way. I want to talk about these issues on camera and in videos, and about growing to love yourself, because I've been at those lowest points and I have hated everything about myself, and I have physically harmed myself because I hated what I saw so much, and I have fought my way out of that over a long period of time, both in terms of sometimes physically changing the things about myself, like with my teeth and getting the fillings and getting all this very painful dental work done, and also sometimes just learning to accept myself and have a bit more confidence. For example, not giving in to all the pressure and, changing my teeth shape too much. It's a mix of physically doing things and just working on my self-confidence. And I think the point I try and make is that, like, if I can do it, anyone can do it. But so many people just look at the end result and they don't see the journey, and they definitely don't see the starting point. And so they dismiss everything I've been through, and I do find it really, really hurtful. Anyway, personal rant over. God, I'm sorry. The point was, stop judging people based on whatever false assumptions you make about them based on outward appearance. Anyway, God, that was a long rant. I'm so sorry. Yeah, let's get back to the book. It goes on and it gets quite patronizing again. Oh my God, sorry about that. Yeah, here's a patronizing section that says, there is nothing unsexier than a desperate-looking person. By desperate, here we refer to an individual who is so desperate to be in a relationship that they behave in an overly clingy and keen way towards any potential partners. Not looking desperate is socially sophisticated behavior and quite an art. And then the rest of the paragraph does actually go on to talk about some really useful stuff about, like, accepting being happy alone, which I think is great advice. But this whole don't look desperate section just feels really patronizing and kind of icky. And then they have this weird section about telling people that you're autistic. It would be best to disclose your AS when you have dated a few times and you have agreed to make the relationship official. This will be explained later. At this stage, your partner would have seen enough of you to develop any feelings towards you and maybe beginning to care about you, your happiness and welfare. Any earlier, it could scare your partner off. Any later, serious misunderstandings could occur. Having lived with AS, you will know what the term serious misunderstanding means. Educating, but not lecturing or going on endlessly about it. Your partner oh my God, wait. Some of the grammar in this book is terrible. I feel like they didn't have editors or a proofreader. So educating, but not lecturing or going on endlessly about it. Your partner about AS, that's horribly written. God. So educating but not lecturing or going on endlessly about AS to your partner would make more sense, generally, and how it affects you individually is fundamental for the health of the budding relationship. Again, I don't know how to feel about this. I have really weird mixed feelings. So, I don't like the idea of hiding something fundamental about you until they already have feelings for you, to quote what they said here. Like, for me, now that I know these things about myself, like, it feels like just a part of who I am. And if someone's scared off by it, then they're clearly not right for me. It'd be like, hiding the fact that I have a dog for the first few dates because I'm worried that this person might not be a dog person. So I trick them into liking me. And then suddenly I'm like, oh, surprise, here's a dog. Like, that's a bit weird and a bit much, right? It's like you're trying to trick them into liking you. And, I don't know, it just feels a bit manipulative, doesn't it? I don't know. Personally, I don't see the point in hiding. But ultimately, I think you just need to judge this for yourself based on who you are and the person that you're seeing and who they are. I think it's important to tell them in your own time when you feel safe and comfortable and can trust them, but also don't purposefully hide it to trick them into getting feelings for you, like this book seems to suggest. The idea of waiting to tell them until you trust them is absolutely fine, but waiting to tell them until they already have feelings and might not want to back out because they already like that just feels weird and manipulative, right? That's not just me, is it? The next section talks about going on actual dates, and I do like some of the points they raise here because they talk about things like, picking a restaurant might not be a good idea for a date because of food issues, so they suggest things like eating somewhere more casually, like a cafe, or going somewhere that you are already familiar with, or checking the menu in advance. I think they're great bits of advice, really genuinely helpful. But then it gets onto this section about sex, and again, it just feels oddly judgy with these rules that they bring in. Like, they have these lines that say things like, ideally, sex should be a reflection of love. However, some people are happy with sex that is purely based on lust. And ideally, sex should occur in a long-term committed relationship. However, this is not always the case. I'm not a fan of these statements and how they're written. They feel a bit like they're saying it should be this way, and if it's not, well, I guess you can do it, but we're also kind of judging you. I think the right way to talk about sex is to just remove all stigma and remove words like should and ideally, because there's no one right way to have sex. There are some things that are non-negotiable, like consent. Use words like should there. There should be consent. There has to be consent. That's fair. But when it comes to things like the circumstances for who you have sex with and when and why, get rid of words like should and ideally and just talk about, how to figure out what's right for you and how there's no shame in whatever you want and whatever works for you. Use words like should to say you should communicate with your partner, you should be open and honest with them, not you should have sex for love. And no. It might seem like semantics, but I think these things are very important and worth discussing. So it's all very odd. This whole chapter kind of focuses on, it talks a lot about things like follow this social rule and then follow this one and do it because your partner will probably expect it. But none of it ever really comes down to explaining very simply that dating is about enjoying spending time with someone and getting to really know someone. It's about you both making each other feel good. And this chapter doesn't touch on any of what I think are important topics, like how to figure out if someone's right for you or not. It talks about dating like it's something you have to do and you're just trying to go through the motions and like successfully check off like a list of things you should be doing. It doesn't really talk about it like it's something to actually enjoy and enhance part of your life, and it's just very odd to me. It talks about like fulfilling these expectations of a neurotypical partner because they expect it. It doesn't talk about things like, finding a partner who fulfills your needs and wants. It doesn't talk about the fact that you should be doing things for your partner to make them happy. It just talks about doing it because that's what's expected. And I think that's a really harmful way of approaching this topic. In the next chapter, there's a section about disagreements and like arguments and stuff in relationships. And it has this one part that really, really bothers me. You should always try and see the argument from your partner's point of view, which is true. For Aspies, seeing things from another person's point of view or having empathy is something that doesn't come easily if you're not used to it. Aspies are seen to be naturally lacking in theory of mind or being naturally empathic. This might be something initially you may have to force yourself to do. It is certainly possible to teach yourself to empathize with others, which again feels like it's perpetuating this really, really harmful stereotype. And again, it seems to be more geared towards men and boys than to women, like a lot of books and resources for autistic people are, which is a real shame. There are more and more nowadays being written for women and by women, which I think are fantastic. I'm currently reading Odd Girl Out by Laura James, which is wonderful so far. I've not quite finished it, I've got a couple of chapters left, but while I don't fully agree with everything she writes, I do love the majority of the book, and it does kind of feel like reading a book written about myself and my own experiences, and I think it's great, so I do recommend it. Anyway, the point is, back to this book. I, for example, am a very empathetic person, and I think a lot of women, even autistic women, also are too. Just because we sometimes struggle to identify someone's emotion based purely on, for example, facial expressions or body language, that doesn't mean we don't care about or understand the emotions when they're explained to us. It doesn't mean that we lack empathy. The fact that they keep coming back to this whole having empathy is something that doesn't come easily to autistic people thing, without also explaining that not every autistic person is like that, feels a little offensive and harmful to me. And I just feel like, again, it's feeding into these negative and harmful stereotypes. It really bothers me when I've read books on autism or papers on autism that kind of debate whether we have empathy, whether we can feel love, whether we have feeling. Like, it's disgusting. We're autistic, but we're still human. Many of us struggle to identify what emotions other people are feeling. Many of us maybe struggle to express our feelings properly or to name our feelings or recognize them. We can have issues like that, but we're not all just cold, heartless machines who don't care about other people. And it surprises me that we even still need to have these debates. It bothers me. Then there was a section on communication in long-term relationships. And I was really looking forward to this section because, like I say, this is something that I've personally struggled with. But instead of actually helping, it just lists off a bunch of potential problems and then says, go work with a counsellor on these, which is not helpful at all. The closest it gets to providing any actual advice is to say, in any relationship, you need to communicate with each other regularly. So their advice is literally, if you're struggling to communicate, just communicate, you know? There's also this really kind of icky section on marriage and kids. in which they recommend that, and this is the bad bit. Some people may wish to seek genetic counselling due to the unconfirmed possibility of Asperger or autistic children being born should you be considering children in marriage. Which basically means, because we know or highly suspect there's a genetic component to autism, the likelihood is that autistic people might have autistic children. And they're saying, seek genetic counselling, in that maybe you want to do genetic screening on your children to see if they're likely to be autistic. Maybe you want to talk to someone about the likelihood of having autistic children. Maybe you should think twice about having autistic children. Maybe you want to avoid having autistic children. Autistic children are bad in some way. And I spoke about this a while ago now in my video about, I think it was Micah Stauffer, the woman who basically gave up her autistic adopted child because she couldn't cope with him. In that video, I made a point about, and I don't know if this is a controversial opinion or not, but I made a point about how I think if you're going to be a parent and have children, you need to be prepared for any outcome. I don't know, it feels kind of gross. For example, I don't ever want kids because I think I'd be a terrible parent. And I would not be able to cope with kids with many health problems, but I also don't think I'd be able to cope with kids with no health problems. So I'm never having kids, because I don't think it's fair to bring a kid into the world if I can't look after them. But if you make that decision to be a parent, I think you also take on that decision to love your kid regardless of who they are, or to care for your kid regardless of who they are, and to give them the best life possible. I think if you're like, I want a kid, but I don't want an autistic one. I don't want an ill one. I don't want a gay one. I don't think you should be a parent. I think you need to care for your child and accept them however they are. And this idea of, especially if you're autistic yourself, then being like, oh, well, I don't think I want an autistic child. Let me do genetic screening to make sure I don't get that one. It's just a little bit gross, isn't it? I don't know. It's even more disturbing when you understand the history of like the term Asperger's and the whole history with the Nazis, and trying to kind of make a distinction between which autistic babies should be euthanized and which ones would be useful. That's a bit of a gross oversimplification, but the point is all of this together just feels a bit gross. Not a fan. And then the book ends with case studies, interviewing one autistic man who has never been in a relationship and one autistic woman who is married. And again, this section was a bit hit and miss for me. I think some of the questions that they ask are quite offensive. For example, they ended both interviews by asking, do you feel you have sufficient empathy to have a relationship? Again, coming back to this harmful idea that autistic people aren't empathetic. Autistic people don't feel empathy. Autistic people don't care about people, you know? The interview with the woman raises some really interesting points, though. Like, she talks about how she spent a lot of time jumping from one relationship to another because she wanted social interaction, but she felt more secure in one-on-one situations. And I quote, she said, which is why my preference was to always be with a partner as opposed to socializing in wider peer groups, which I think is a really, really interesting point. And that's something that I'd like to read a lot more about, because it's something they actually relate to, and I want to see that explored further and try and understand that and look into it. But they just move on and it's never mentioned again. So it feels like a missed opportunity. It's a shame. She also goes on to talk about the way in which autism has affected various relationships of hers, and she argues that, and again I quote, I believe AS needs to be portrayed in a more balanced way, highlighting the positive aspects as well as the negative, which again is something that I thoroughly agree with. It's a very important point. It's one that again was brought up in the introduction to this book, but not in any of the pages in between, which is a real issue. So like I say, there are good parts of this book, they just aren't written by the actual authors, which is a shame. And that's where the book ends. So there we go. Overall, I was absolutely not impressed. I don't think this is necessarily the worst book out there. It's not evil and horrific and terrible and should be burned, but I do think it definitely contributes to the stigma around people with autism. I do think it talks down to us and is incredibly patronizing. I do think it makes us appear childlike and cold and heartless, and generally just offers no real help or solutions for the things most of us actually struggle with. But I also know that that's just my opinion, and other people may have a different experience with it and may actually get a lot out of this book, so that's just me. Anyway, that is me done for today. Please let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. To end this with a little bit of shameless self-promotion, I have my second video coming out for my art channel really soon. If you want to go check it out, it's just Rachel Oates Art, and I'm having a lot of fun with it, and I'm feeling really inspired again, and it's so fun to just be creating content again for the sake of it and for the fun of it without having to worry about views or money or whatever. It's just something that I'm very passionate about. I'm hoping to kind of document my progress as I get better with art and work to improve things, and I'm going to be trying out some different products and reviewing things and taking you through a few of my like processes for how I do certain paintings and whatever. I'll probably try out a few little like art tips and hacks and tricks and follow some tutorials and stuff like that. So it's just something that I'm having a bit of fun with and doing for myself. It's a bit of a passion project. So if you want to come along to that journey with me, you can subscribe to that too, and I would really appreciate it. But as always, no pressure. So there's that. Anyway, this is where I'm going to end this today. Thank you for listening to me rant, especially my little emotional tangent in the middle. Thank you for putting up with that. But for now, thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. I hope you're all having a wonderful day.